I'll put it this way. Should Democrats be in jail? No question. When Donald Trump gets elected, should he start locking them up? No question. Should there be lists of Democrats that need to go to jail? 100%. And the reason for that is they've committed crimes. We need to make sure that when Donald Trump wins, we've got an attorney general, a deputy attorney general, a head of the CIA and the FBI. Kash Patel would be fantastic. We can have attorney general. There's some names floating around. And then they can start having their investigators and the feds issuing subpoenas, pulling up evidence, and with real evidence, bring them to judges for warrants. Then these people can spend three years of their lives fighting tooth and nail for the crime against the government for crimes they committed, and we can prove. Yeah. And the reason why we put them on trial is that we can show the whole world we will uncover what you've done. We will make sure everyone knows, and you will be held accountable for it.
Not just jail, they should get the death penalty. You know, we actually used to have the punishment for treason in this country.
Awesome. Yeah, so what did I miss? Did any of you guys call it for executing any of your political enemies?
No, you basically missed nothing. That was the if you're just joining us, Ben was having some internet issues, and we just said fuck it, do it live, and started without him. But that was the cold open, so you're caught up. You're caught up. For those of you who are confused about what you just saw, it was a screen share of the Tim Pool show. Is that the name of the show? The Tim Pool show? I don't know.
It's the Timcast or something like that.
The Timcast, the pool party.
Pool party.
Much better than Timcast.
If he's not using pool party, I think that you should actually approach him with that.
Yeah. So it was like, I think it's a screen recording because what happened was when Laura Loomer decided to call for the death of their political enemies, they cut the stream. So just said stream over.
My understanding is this is not the first time this has come up.
No, unfortunately isn't, and we happen to have it.
I think it's only fair that I don't take the heat for what you said, Jesse, and I'm not trying to be, but I'm getting people attacking my character now for having had to take the show down because you made 2 allusions to killing people. So I'm not trying to be a right now, but like I've got 500 messages of like, what you're doing, why you're taking the show down, are you with us, you're trying to make money.
So I thought YouTube took the show down.
No, I had to take the show down. Okay. I had to take the show down because you made 2 allusions within like the span of a couple minutes to murdering people.
I mean, credit where credit's due, I suppose. That Tim is in fact trying to restrain his guests from calling for murder on air. I will note that as somebody who has been doing a weekly political podcast for the last 4 years, I actually don't recall ever having to do that.
Yeah, it's there's a very specific Onion article that I actually don't want to say. I don't want to mention. Those of you who know, right? Why do all these keep blanking my blank? But it's
yeah, exactly.
You do wonder why that's a problem for Tim's show more than other shows if he's so anti-murdering people, you know?
Yeah. No, it's a weird coincidence. But this show is Give Them an Argument. I'm Ben Burgis. I am joined as always by our super producer, Jake Appett, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. I am going to be joined in fewer minutes than I thought because we started late, by Daniel Tut, who is a returning champ, but he's going to be joining us to talk about Mark Fisher's depressingly evergreen essay, Exiting the Vampire's Castle. Really looking forward to that. And in the post game, we're going to have Matthew Whalan on to watch. We watched most of this last Thursday, but to watch the last little bit of the debate between Dave Smith and Cenk Uygur on one side and Batya Ungar-Sargon, which somebody said last week sounded like a Lovecraftian incantation, and Dennis Prager on the other about Israel, Palestine, and Iran. Actually we do have a little I believe we do have a clip from that debate. So this is from the part that we already watched, but it is really striking. You're going to see Dennis Prager making two very specific factual claims here about his record.
There is one difference between Hamas and the Nazis, and I never called any group in my 40 years of radio Nazi. I never called an individual that, other than the Nazis of the 1940s.
The point is that people who supported the war in Iraq, like Benjamin Netanyahu, like I'm sure you did, sir.
No,
right?
I didn't.
You didn't.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm wrong.
Wait,
I apologize for that.
Let me just say very quickly.
That's fair. I shouldn't have said that then.
No, that's fair. No, you don't have to apologize.
All right. So, to review, what two things did we just learn about Dennis Prager's record?
He is only called Nazis.
Right.
Is number one, right?
Before Hamas, he'd never made any Nazi analogies. Yep, that's one.
Oh yeah, because Hamas is the first group to warrant it, and that's what's so striking about them. And the second is that he did not support the Iraq War.
Yeah. So on an unrelated subject, I was looking, as one does, at Dennis Prager's online store, pragerstore.com.
Do that a lot, honestly. Just
yeah,
looking for the kids,
especially around Christmas. You
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, Christmas, Hanukkah, friends' birthdays, right? There are all kinds of good reasons to check out pragerstore.com. I also particularly like the fact that he's one of the few places that's still selling his products in formats that others have abandoned, like CDs. And in particular, I noticed that he's selling a CD of an old debate he did decades ago with Rabbi Michael Lerner, right? A debate with the left, Dennis Prager and Michael Lerner. So he's selling a CD of that for the low price of $18. And helpfully, he has a description under that of his debate with Rabbi Lerner. Point 3 of the description is, one of you guys want to read this first sentence?
Yeah, Prager argues that America is a force for good in the world and is in favor of invading Iraq because he believes Saddam Hussein is a modern-day Hitler.
That's odd. Because I thought I knew two things about his past, and now I just don't know what to think.
Yeah, that's actually an extremely efficient lie. Like within, you know what I mean? Like just to within such a short span of time to just completely refute yourself. It's like the advanced stats that he's putting up and lying for those sports fans. Like it's got to be pretty impressive.
Yeah, I would think so. Of course, I get it. I'm sure a lot of people who supported invading Iraq because they thought Saddam Hussein was Hitler. It was just kind of going around in 2002, 2003. Regret that and wish they could take it back. Similarly, I am fairly certain that in the 2040s, there are going to be an awful lot of people saying, what? I didn't support Netanyahu. What are you talking about? That didn't happen. But if you're going to, if you're going to come out on the right side of one of these things, the time to do so would actually be right now. And so it has, that's also true. The 1940s were part of the modern era. So technically speaking, modern day Hitler would be Hitler.
I thought the commenter, I'm so stupid. I thought the commenter was asserting that there just is a modern day Hitler out there. And it's like, he's right there. Like, you don't, the modern day Hitler is around.
They made that sitcom about him in England.
Yeah. He's
My Neighbor Hitler.
Yeah.
No,
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, nobody's done my long-standing suggestion for a sitcom, which would be, people always ask, like, if you went back in time, would you kill baby Hitler? And it always seems like a binary option, like you either kill him or you just like let things proceed, and the war, the genocide, and all that. But I've always thought, and this seems like a natural concept for a sitcom. No, you don't kill baby Hitler, but you also don't just leave him be. You abduct baby Hitler, bring him back to a later point in time, and just deposit him with some like nice suburban Jewish family and like give him a better upbringing. And so he doesn't do any of that stuff. So, I mean, can't you just see the sitcom Raising Hitler? I totally watch that.
It reminds me of that poet. Remember who did the poem for Putin? If I Was Your Mother. Yes. Remember that? she was onto something.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my God, it could be all
she will adopt
Raising Putin. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Agreed. But anyway, the point was if someone catches you on something in your next debate, which by the way we're definitely going to release on CD and cassette for $20 to $25, just say I never said that. I never said that.
What? No, I didn't. What are you talking about?
He goes on to say, I think we cut it right before that. He said it on Chris Matthews, and Chris Matthews was shocked.
Yes, he didn't want to invade Iraq. Yeah. So I don't know. Michael Lerner and Chris Matthews could compare notes about their conversation and figured out what he said to who, and try to work backwards to figure out his position. Yeah, but of course there are quite a few people who are opposing the current war right now. A lot of them on college campuses. Most of the American campuses, of course, are on break right now in any case, which is part of what made the haste to crack down on the encampment so ridiculous that, people are about to go home anyway. Next Monday, I'm actually doing a Zoom teach-in for a campus encampment in Poland. I guess the semester's still going there, but in any case, at NYU, for example, that's all been dispersed and people have gone home in any case. But there were a bunch of students who were arrested over the course of that. And there was initially some talk about kicking them out of the university. That didn't happen. But apparently some of them have been, as part of the disciplinary process that they have to go through to come back to campus in the fall, they took a page out of the glorious history of the People's Republic of China and decided to send them for a little re-education. And in the weirdest, most like hacky, bureaucratic, neoliberal way humanly imaginable. So as part of this process, students were assigned this 49-page packet that I've gotten my hands on a copy of. I wrote this up for Jacobin. It's called the Ethos Integrity Series. So it's a packet of 7 modules that they have to work through. And then as well as the stuff in the packet, I guess after they were, done with their re-education, some of the students were, to prove it, to write a essay reflecting on what they did. And according to the New York Times write-up of this, they were specifically told that they weren't allowed to try to justify their actions. So the modules they had to work through were on moral reasoning, which, is fascinating to me for many reasons. And one of them, of course, is that as a, on-again, off-again philosophy professor for many years, I have taught about a zillion sections of introductory ethics classes. And so I was like, teaching moral reasoning, that's interesting. I want to know what that's like. And I ended up saying in the Jacobin article that, obviously as a human being, I'm offended that the university decided that people needed rudimentary instruction in moral reasoning because they were protesting a genocide. But as a philosophy professor, I'm professionally offended that this is what they think educational moral reasoning looks like, because this is so weird and incoherent. Where to start with this? I think I sent Andy the PDF of the packet. So I think we did pull a few things out. I know at one point they made people watch a Simpsons episode, so I guess I can't complain about that. That's kind of fun.
Yeah, it says before doing any of the reading for this module, start by watching season 10, episode 7 of the Simpsons television show. Lisa Gets an A. You may rent this DVD from a public library or view it online through various. Well, a lot of like physical media references tonight, or online through various.
Vinyl.
Yeah. We pressed it on vinyl for you guys because that's what you kids like. Or view it online through various providers that may have it available: Hulu, Netflix, YouTube, Simpsons World, etc. I mean,
hold on. Is that Simpsons World? Is that like is this approved like by Disney? What like I'm a little unfamiliar with this website.
I did not click through to that link. I should have.
Yeah.
Okay. Are they telling you to pirate it?
Yeah.
If it's on YouTube, they kind of are.
Oh, that's true. That is actually an interesting point. I don't know that I remember Lisa Gets an A off the top of my head. I mean, everybody.
I looked up the Wikipedia page. Basically, after church on Sunday, they go to a grocery store to eat like the samples things for their Sunday brunch, and Homer gets obsessed with certain kinds of ice cream, so he sends Lisa into the freezer to get the ice cream, to which she gets a cold, and she ends up staying home and gets hooked on a video game, which meant that when she felt better, she goes back to school, wasn't prepared for a test, and so she buys the test from Nelson and gets an A+++, which raised the school's GPA high enough to the bare minimum standards of the school district, and that allowed the school to get a grant of money that they desperately needed.
Okay. This has actually started to come back to me. I haven't gone back and revisited it because it's in season 10, and come on. That's not, there are many seasons of The Simpsons that are worth going back to over and over again. That's really not one of them. But yeah, it's it's like this is all kind of strange and infantilizing, and it kind of gets even worse when you like really dig into some of this stuff, because they say all these bizarre things. Like, one thing, nobody who actually teaches any real ethics classes at NYU was consulted in preparing this document. Of that, I'm 100% sure.
They would have recommended a better Simpsons episode.
Not because I think that they would necessarily all be above it. I don't know those people, but like just because like I think that just on the level of professional competence, I think it would have been better than this. They had like, it's like, okay, so gonna teach them moral reasonings. They're gonna read some Kant, some John Stuart Mill, get some of the sort of main competing moral theories, think about the arguments for and against them. No, there's like a checklist of values that students, are instructed to numerically rank. That the only ones that are overtly political, and I should say, I mean, this bizarre bureaucratic exercise was clearly not invented just for this, but it's sort of particularly offensive that people are being made to do it for this context. But I actually think anybody in any context should be offended that you're being told to work through this. And by the way, I'll even say, calling balls and strikes, that that it's a very I actually think any like conservative student who was told to do they had to do this would have a legitimate complaint about ideological bias, because they talk about values and societal standards, and there's a line in there that's like, environmental protection is now one of these, thanks to blah blah blah, the efforts of Vice President Al Gore, and like, okay, but in any case, they have all this, like the checklist of values. The only overtly political ones are diversity, equity, and patriotism. But there is then there's just a lot of normal shit, like just sort of interpersonal things. There is also some blanks, so you can write in your own. So I don't know if preventing war crimes is a value that you could list without being asked to retake it. But they say all these things about like there are no better or worse values, which is like, okay, if you actually believe that, then I don't understand the ban on students trying to justify their actions, because if it's all relative, it makes it like even more confusing that you have to come to the approved conclusion. But B, it's like, I don't know, any normal ethics class, you'd spend a lot of time early in the class, like kind of trying to show that this is a crazy thing to say, because that sort of undermines the whole premise of the class, that like it makes sense to think through moral theories and moral arguments and all that stuff. If it's just kind of, I don't know, man, whatever vibe, whatever the vibes you feel are. And, people, so it's like, is moral progress possible? Like if you have, antebellum Southern society, it was generally accepted that slavery was fine. Now there's a consensus in the opposite direction. Is that progress, or is it just, that was right for them, this is right for us? Like, again, I'm sure all this is unintentional. It's just like being designed by like weird, stupid bureaucrats. But the thing that really, that really struck me about it, like way back at the beginning, although you are completing this project as a sanction for being found responsible for an NYU policy in violation, we hope that you will find this experience both educational and beneficial for your daily life, which is just one of those sentences that I don't know about you guys. I cannot read without hearing it in the voice, that sort of like vaguely British female robot voice you get in a science fiction movie telling you that the blast doors were closed and the self-destruct sequence could not be canceled.
Yeah, I mean, do we know who? I feel like Andy has a specific reference in mind, but at this point,
well, I mean, this season of Doctor Who, they have the same actress show up in every episode, and I think it's her.
But so we don't know who wrote it, right? Because it feels like HR talk to me, you know what I mean? And well, it feels like two things to me: the HR talk, and second, remember when we covered the like woke anti-union podcast and material? Like it really reminds me of that, because that's the best analog I could think of when a corporate entity that's trying to act all liberal and super woke, or whatever word you want to use, is effectively trying to manipulate and re-educate you. You know what I mean? Like the anti-union stuff really has a lot of the same kind of flavor to this. It's really really creepy though. like you said, it's very it's very unsettling. Like I hope you enjoy this like mandatory summer work. Like they don't even enjoy their like normal class, let alone what percentage of students, I mean, maybe, not to be cynical, but yeah, I mean, who's
no, well, I mean, I'm like, look, yeah, I mean, it's totally going to be I mean, it's like, I am 100% sure that most of I mean, I don't know this for a fact, but like, I would be really shocked if the people who put this together didn't work for the human resources department. Certainly none of them worked for the philosophy department, but like my guess would be the human resources department.
I wonder if that all values are equal as like someone looks at it. It's probably because there's so much, people give so many fucking notes, right? And then so then you have to change it, and then you can't do the right. So someone's like, oh, well, if we probably should put something in, so it doesn't seem like we're putting any values over anything else. I'll just say all values are equal. That will solve that problem, and then it's I mean, the final product is probably even butchered compared to like the initial draft, which like probably made a little bit more sense, would be my guess based on how like it probably ran through like 5 different passes, you know what I mean? Like it just I would guess that might be part of the incoherence there, just like many hands, too many cooks.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that is a fair guess.
I gotta say though, my favorite part though was the part where they decided to list the various like different groups have different moral standards, and so like they linked to the Declaration of Independence, the Ten Commandments, Google about.google.com, which I clicked on that because I was curious, like what is this? Clicked on it. It is a link to a 2-hour video about AI.
As one of the, yeah, that's good. So you're hitting all the classics for all the important values.
Yes.
Yeah, I did notice that so on page 18 of the packet, students are instructed to rank the top 10 values/ethical standards of New York University, your family, your closest college friend/friendship group, and then there's like a blank so they can fill in like a fourth group, whose values they want to describe.
Obviously, the GTAA community.
Yeah.
The patrons, yeah.
Yeah, please. Yes, if there are any GTA patrons being subjected to these modules right now, I really hope they put that down. I mean, I'd suggested in the Jackman article that perhaps the fourth entity besides NYU, your family, and your friendship group that they could list as like that they wanted to describe their values could be perhaps the International Criminal Court, which has requested warrants for Netanyahu and various other people. But again, perhaps that could be seen as trying to justify their actions. So that's not allowed. Whereas if you say they give them an argument Patreon community, I'm guessing that most NYU administrators don't know what that is and aren't going to bother looking it up.
I like what Antonio said. You can say the people that donate the money that you require to function. I wonder if they would turn that back to you and give you another. Like, what happens if you fail this module? Do they give you? Is it modules all the way down, or do you have to retake the module? Or
Yeah. Or there are students who are like going through, like they've failed so many times that like they're actually writing new modules on the fly to give them because they ran out of all the ones that they had prepared for the disciplinary process.
A lot of this stuff does feel kind of like in the universe of The Simpsons, honestly. So it's, but not for the reason they think. But anyway,
yeah, no, that's fair. Well, yeah, I am. I'm looking forward to going to bring on Daniel in just a moment. Looking forward to that conversation. Been a little bit fried. Been I have the new environment in the background. I don't think this is where I'm going to be setting up in the future, but as I'm moving most of my stuff to the new apartment, this is good enough for now. There's actually a really nice view out that window, but when I tried to do this with the blinds open, it's just like blinding sunlight. So it doesn't look, then I'm kind of in shadow, but it's been good, been back in Mexico since Saturday, and moved into the new apartment. Everything's been good. I see they even, to make me feel more welcome and comfortable, they even yesterday they even made a left-wing Jewish woman the president of Mexico. So I appreciated that gesture. Somebody Ben will be comfortable with.
It's similarly one that has a questionable link to Judaism. No, I'm kidding. That's what people were saying. Her husband is Jesus. So people were like, why did she thank Jesus in her election speech? She must not be. A lot of Zionists were trying to claim that she's not Jewish, but she was just thanking her husband.
Yeah. Exactly. No, there's what can you say? She loves Jesus. As for many years. Yeah,
I
fair
can
enough.
make some very inappropriate jokes right now. So yeah, use your imagination.
She just got in. She just got in. Give her.
Okay. That's what the post game's for. So we will save that for then, and I will talk to you guys then. Right now, let us bring on Daniel Tut.
What's going on, Ben? How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
How's Mexico? Not bad.
Mexico is good.
Where are you exactly? Tijuana?
No, I'm in Rosarito, so it's like about it's like 40 minutes away from Tijuana. Yep. So there's actually, like I said, if I open the blind behind me right now, that'd be like, it would just be like sunlight and I would look shadowy, but like but there's actually like a really nice view of the ocean out of that, out of that window. So it is so yeah, it's good. It's been good, but we are going to depart from it's like there's it's a line in the first chapter of Capital where Marx says it's like finished talking about these examples, like about Robinson Crusoe, and he says, leave Crusoe's sun-drenched island to to go think about medieval Europe. We're going to leave sun-drenched Rosarito to move into the darkness inside the vampire's castle. So
Indeed. Yes.
I think Jake, we have a clip to set this up.
There's too much focus on making socialism a social distinction. It's not. It's a movement for liberation that means including many different people. And of course, that brings us back to Mark Fisher's genius 2014 essay that we haven't fully absorbed yet, The Vampire Castle. A socialism that's exclusive cannot win, and is exactly the kind of toxic strategy that we need to avoid on all costs and only plays into the hands of capital. As Mark Fisher argued, why would capital be concerned about a left that replaces class politics with moralizing individualism that's far from building solidarity and spreads fear and insecurity?
Yeah, so that is the late Michael Brooks a few years ago talking about this essay. I think I first heard about it from him probably back in like 2018 or something. I don't remember exactly. But he referred to it a lot. I remember him saying something that's always stuck with me that says that it always feels like it was written last week, which is definitely my feeling. It's sort of depressingly evergreen. But yeah, I mean, you want to maybe, like, before we really get into it, you want to maybe take a long step back and set this up a little bit, right? So, aside from this essay, right? Who's, who is this guy, Mark Fisher?
So he's a philosopher, cultural critic. He's politically, he's like an old school socialist. That's kind of like his background.
Yeah.
He was Goldsmiths. He was affiliated with this thing called the CCRU, which was this kind of research lab that birthed what we know as the accelerationist kind of wacko British post-structuralist, very Deleuzian, very French theory, very cybernetic, very kind of like Baudrillard and this kind of but undergirding a lot of the CCRU stuff was a very, very profound political pessimism, right? So Nick Land swam in these waters. Fisher and Land were somewhat polar opposites, politically speaking, is important to state. But at the same time, Mark Fisher had a certain view of Nick Land that there's a kernel of something actually quite ingenious about what he philosophizes about. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but that is Fisher's claim. Mark Fisher created a blog called K-Punk, which became a cult sensation. He was a great writer, a unique writer. He wrote a book called Capitalist Realism, which I think sold even more than Angela Nagel's book at Zero, the
Mhm.
#1 seller. For it came out in 2017, so it came out after the Vampire essay, which actually came out in November of 2013. We'll talk about that in a moment. That's what made Fisher's name very well known across the Atlantic, and he became an Anglo-American sort of sensation. He was a good intellectual. He believed deeply in the left, in the meaning of the left. I think at the heart of the essay is a question about what is the meaning of the left? What does it mean to belong on the left? So with Mark Fisher, you have a conflicted philosopher who's sort of abandoning a lot of his origins philosophically, and that's actually what I always liked about Mark. Even though I never met him, I always read him very closely.
Mhm.
He wrote a lot about mental health. He wrote a lot in a very vulnerable way. That's why people are drawn to Mark. He was very vulnerable about his depression. He committed suicide. Undergirding the Vampire essay is a question about the politics of depression itself, because part of the argument of the Vampire Castle sort of tendency is a question of political despair, right? And the management of political despair. How is political despair to fuse with the left, which is a utopian project, which is a class project, which is a universalist project? How does a melancholic, sad affect left survive? Is sort of the question at the heart of the Vampire Castle essay, and at the heart of Mark's work. So Fisher was a complex thinker. I think he's sorely missed, and yeah, I don't know if that does justice. If you want to add anything, but that would be a snapshot of Mark Fisher.
Yeah, I think that's good, and I'm glad that you mentioned capitalist realism, because I think that that's important for those written later. But I think the views in there, I think, are important context for what's going on in the Vampire's Castle essay. Since that book, which is it's a very zero books-ish book. You can definitely read it in an afternoon, and I'd recommend doing so. I think it's very, very good. But that's a lot of it's cultural criticism and very insightful, interested, in parts of it kind of uncomfortable to read, at least for me, because there are sort of things that he describes about the the way people kind of swim through constant distraction and things like that hit a little bit too close to home in certain sections. But the sort of political core of it, right, is it's about, capitalist realism, right, is it's like a bit of a play on words, right, because socialist realism is like a art style that's sort of, I always think of as like heroic proletarian tractor art, and capitalist realism, there's obviously a reference, but it's sort of the opposite, right? Like it's not just that it's capitalist rather than socialist, but it's that capitalist realism, what's being described there, is not like liking capitalism. It's not celebrating capitalism. It's sort of this kind of deeply resigned acceptance that there's just nothing you can do about it. That it's just like a fact of nature, and I think that is to my mind, I think that insight, right? I mean, he quotes the thing at the beginning about how it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I think
a quote that nobody knows who the real author of that is. People say it's Frederick Jameson. I've heard it's a sci-fi author. Nobody really knows who said that first. I think it was Jameson, though, actually.
Yeah. In capitalist realism, Fisher just sort of says it's been attributed to Zizek and Jameson, and he doesn't really say. But yeah. It probably is Jameson. But like he's saying, he's saying that, and I think this is a really important insight, because that I think goes to a lot more than just like, the sort of, I don't know, if you think about this in like second, like the Socialist Party is the Second International, the way they would talk about this stuff is you have your maximum program, which is like getting rid of capitalism, and then the minimum program, which are like social democratic reforms you think you could achieve in the short term. And I would argue that, and I think a lot of what Fisher's writing points at this, that this kind of like deep attitude of resignation that he's describing, it's like, yeah, I know it sucks, but I'm so thoroughly convinced that it's never going away, that I'm just, there's just no point to like having a politics about it, complaining about it. I think it goes not just for the sort of non-achievement of the maximum program, but even for the way that people think about like the minimum program in the era of like deep neoliberalism that, I always think about like during the 2020 presidential primaries, with the sole exception of South Carolina, all the states that Joe Biden won, when it was still meaningfully contested at the beginning in exit polls, most people said they were in favor of Medicare for all. And so you think, okay, well, what's going on here, right? You have Bernie Sanders, Mr. Medicare for all. Biden actually said at one point he would veto it if it ever came up. And it just seems like the explanation there is it's like, yeah, most people like the idea. If a pollster asks them, they're like, yeah, sure, that sounds good. But their entire experience of politics tells them that that's not going to happen, right? That just doesn't sound like the kind of thing that would happen. So it's just not going to impact their political behavior because they just don't take it seriously as a possibility, right? I mean, that's that kind of point about like bone deep capitalist realism. And, I'm not doing justice to the book. People should read the book. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there about, gangster movies, about universities, about a lot of things that, as you say, is a very good writer. But, in a lot of ways, that's kind of about the reaction of like the larger culture to this sense that, capitalism is, decisively won, that there's just no room for like anything real to happen, on the left, all that stuff. And in some ways, I think, the Vampire Castle essay, I would think of it as sort of talking about how that plays out on the left itself, right? That people, don't think they can, don't think they can win, whether they'll officially admit that or not. And, how that sort of, how they act in light of that.
Yeah, let's touch on it now. So I mean, I think that's a good way in through capitalist realism, because what Mark is concerned about is a new generation emerging, sprouting, which is becoming uneasy with the project of representation, with the project of leadership, with the project of a universal platform that could be appealing to the masses. And so he's asking in this essay sort of what is it that is pushing people away from, and in some cases, what we now know happens almost daily on Twitter, of piling on or attacking people for seemingly having success. So his two paradigmatic cases, his examples are Owen Jones and Russell Brand. And he basically says, first with Owen Jones, the charismatic UK socialist, that he was being attacked almost just because he was getting visibility and that he was charismatic. And so the question then is actually interesting, because this goes to Marx's own bona fides in French theory, because in French theory, one does get the idea, say, for example, in Jean-Francois Lyotard, his work, for example, of a kind of hostility to the idea of representational politics, to the idea of leadership. This is coming out of a number of defeats. Think here of the effects of the Cultural Revolution in China and how that spilled over into France. At the heart of that was the presupposition that leadership on a class basis, because, in China, they really elevated the working class to a position of leadership. And that then sort of created a mountain of all kinds of struggle sessions and all challenges and so on. Undying, by the way, the YouTube sensation, has a great video on this. I would highly recommend. I interviewed him on my podcast. So there's this shadow of the Chinese Cultural Revolution at play here. There's the shadow of a deep pessimism coming out of French theory that's at play here, I think at a theoretical level. But Mark is quite vulgar, we should say. Like he's very essentialist. Like I agree with you and Brooks to a certain extent that there is something evergreen about the vampire essay. But I also want to push back on that. I want to push back on that because I would contend that Mark, and I think that Mark knew this, was reifying a class identity while he is adamantly pushing away from these new identitarian groups that are forming. And he calls them petit bourgeois. And this is like a kind of an old class category in classical Marxism, which I think now feels a bit almost like it defines things too broadly, or it's almost nonsensical to call grad student leftists on Twitter petit bourgeois.
Yeah, it's not
almost
it's
nothing.
not it's not accurate.
General, you know,
like that's yeah.
So,
I mean, I think if he'd written it more recently, he probably would have said PMC. You know,
so.
which you know I think is also a very imperfect term, but it's probably less imperfect than petit bourgeois, because you know technically speaking, petit bourgeois would be like, you know, you're like a small shopkeeper or something, and
exactly.
You know, yeah, that's clearly inapplicable here. I do agree, I should say, actually. So anybody who's read my book from 2021, Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left, I talk about the Vampire's Castle essay quite a bit, and it kind of structures a lot of the book, but I do actually make that same point in there about how I think that about identity. I mean, I want to explore more what you mean, but like, you know, but I do say something similar about it, about the sort of class and identity aspect of it, because I do think this is true, right? That there is a that I think that you can, like, when people are sort of like the kind of thing that I think Fisher sort of so brilliantly diagnoses throughout that essay about how people, you know, can play these kinds of, you know, nasty status games, you know, within left spaces, and a lot of that sort of plays out through through like, you know, speaking as a sort of maneuvers. You know, I think that everything he says about that is right, but I also think the way he puts the class component, I think, somewhat misses the possibility. And this is the point I do make in the book that I think is similar to what you just said, that look, I mean, class as an identity can just become another move in that game, right? I mean, that, you know, as someone from a working class background, I can say blah, 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 right? You know, like,
exactly. You know? So there's that tendency that he does with Brand, and of course that never holds up, and that also performs its own type of moralization, just as he's critiquing the kind of these mobs, these sort of like identitarian cancel culture mobs that form almost spontaneously and have this. There is a certain sense in reading the Vampire essay that one needs some psychoanalytic analysis of sort of what's actually psychically driving this. And Mark, incidentally, if people are interested, wrote this thing called acid communism. You see, because Mark had a sort of revelation, I think, in the long sweep of his sort of post-vampire career after this essay, because he received a huge backlash. And I think there's an interesting dynamic of the backlash that he received, which is that a lot of close Mark Fisher acolytes today one could make an argument that they exhibit a lot of the traits that appear as symptomatic of the vampire tendency. they are the ones who want to actually claim Fisher as a split thinker, as like class reductionist on one hand, and then on the other hand, somebody who's open to a countercultural kind of ludic French theory, post-structuralist left. And I think the truth is that Fisher is a kind of Janus face like that himself. He really is. And what he was trying, I think, to do was to study the historical basis of the splitness of the left. So in Acid Communism, he makes an argument that the left has like two super egos. It has what he calls a countercultural left, which comes out of the new left. It comes out of the 60s, and it's a joyful, uplifting, horizontal. So they're opposed to verticalism. They're in some sense opposed to strict representational logics, and they're about utopianism. They're about this kind of positive vision.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing about that tendency of the left is that that tendency has become a sad. So after the collapse of the USSR, after you get capitalist realism, that precise counterculture tendency of the left becomes the vampire castle. And so Fisher is saying, how do we inject some joy into this melancholic left that has seemingly forgotten how to express joy, right? So he wants to redeem this kind of entity on the one hand. On the other hand, he wants this entity to have a relationship that is revolutionary and that is copacetic to a working class centered politics, to a traditional socialist politics. That's the great struggle of Mark Fisher. How do you unite those two tendencies on the left? And I would say that his claim would be, if you don't unite those tendencies, you won't really have a left. That it is actually the task of the left to forge a certain solidarity. That doesn't have to be too idealist, because I think the vulgarity, or maybe the kind of too on the nose vibe of the vampire essay, on the one hand, we should remember that this kind of ultra-liberal cancel culture tendency itself is a reflection of a very sadomasochistic culture. It itself is a reflection, I think, of a society, of a generation who not only is dealing with capitalist realism, but is dealing with declining wages, is dealing with an economy that is stagnant, right? Is dealing with the collapse of the future, which is another huge topic that Mark wrote about, right? And in this, that itself, these kinds of realities are shaping their consciousness.
Well, and
so
it definitely,
they're internalizing it in a certain way. And
I mean, it definitely comes like it definitely relates to the class analysis also, because whereas I do agree with you that there is like a I think some of what he says does sort of neglect the very real possibility that that sort of class identity can just sort of be can just sort of be incorporated as yet another identity in the in sort of ongoing cancel culture games, and I think there's like that's a real thing. But I do think where I think he's onto something is that even if petty bourgeois, which is I don't know. I mean, I have to say, as many times as I've read this essay, I've never really thought that much about that phrase. But I think it's just because like I feel like I was a leftist at a time when that was just sort of an ambient. Well,
I guess what he means by it, I think the best way to understand it is that the identitarians, this is his argument, the identitarians form an identity as a other to a big bourgeois, to the so it's this kind of clinging to something that is unbeknownst to itself. This is why you need psychoanalysis to understand his point, I think, has a paternalistic reliance on the status quo, on bourgeoisie. So in that sense, it's petty bourgeois at this like at the level of social reproduction. At the level of social reproduction, the ideology cannot see that there's nothing about it that would be revolutionary to the status quo, right?
So I think that last part
Because
is definitely a
yeah,
thing he thinks, but I think that but I guess I probably do read the use of the phrase a little differently, because I think that, he is, I mean, look, I think if you read any sort of, British far left, newspaper, I guess we still had those in 2014, then, when this came out, you would see, you would see, like, any sort of, like, I don't know, like Trotskyistish, sort of press, or like the Weekly Worker or something, you would see people using the phrase petty bourgeois, and I think very much the way he's using it here. And I think that it's, like I said, I mean, I can remember a time when that was so commonly used. I think now PMC has kind of replaced it, which is solve some of the conceptual problems and create some new ones, but that just to kind of mean the social layers that are in between, like, the capitalists and the sort of broad mass of the working class, and the sort of politics that are going to come out of those social layers. And I think there is a way that connects with what you were talking about a minute ago, where you were talking about the collapse of the future, the sort of economic precarity that people are facing, and all that stuff. Because I think the way the two, intersect here is that, I mean, like, this is something that's not really made super explicit in the Vampire Castle essay, but I think is true, that a lot of what he's diagnosing on the left is really the sort of left's incorporation of stuff that really comes from liberalism, like just kind of like normal, radical liberal politics, of the kind that's mostly engaged with by people who don't think they're Marxists or socialists or anything like that.
Right.
And I think that, and so I think that look, I mean, a lot of the sort of tendencies towards, identity politics and cancel culture that the essay is talking about, I think make a lot of sense if you think about a politics that sort of comes out of people who are turning on each other in a context of academia, media, a lot of worlds like this that are getting much smaller and much more precarious. There are, if you're trying to climb some kind of, professional ladder, there are a lot fewer ladders than there used to be. And there are a lot more people trying to clamber onto every step. Right. So I think that forms the kind of backdrop for a lot of
that's right. That's why he says these tendencies, and I think he's right about this, foment what he calls the privatization of the left. And so when you have the privatization of the left, the super egoic behavior of individuals within the left, whether that's online or offline, will reflect the zero-sum quasi-sadomasochist logic of austerity institutions, of institutions imposing austerity. And so we reflect those subcultures we reflect that macro culture within our subculture on the left, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's very sound. But like I said, he tries to do some repair in his later work where he says, as criticism of, let's call it the class reductionist view, he calls this the Leninist superego. And he thinks that, and he has a nice reference actually to, like, Lenin. I don't know if you knew this. Lenin once was asked if a revolutionary should indulge in opera themselves as a form of enjoyment, and Lenin said, you should restrain yourself from that. And Fisher said, this is too ascetic. So he accuses Bolshevism, and therefore, I guess by extension, class reductionism. Whether that conflation is valid, that's another story. He thinks it's too ascetic. So therefore, what he's trying to say in his later work is kind of cool, which is both sides of the left, this class first side, and let's call it the counterculture left, right? more anarchist driven, have both forgotten joy. They've both forgotten how to infuse political organizing with a sense of joy, which I thought was such a beautiful and actually quite, in some cases, valid point to make, you know? And then they have this thing they called acid Corbynism. I don't know if you knew about that, where the Jeremy Corbyn's campaign literally took Mark Fisher's ideas and tried to infuse political organizing with the counterculture. Because I think at the heart of what the Vampire Castle essay brings out is how is the left to balance its bohemian petty bourgeois proclivities with a serious class-based socialist universalism. And incidentally, Ben, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I absolutely adore Christopher Lasch, because Christopher Lasch wrote about this in the American scene. He wrote his dissertation on how the left dealt with Bolshevism. And then he wrote dozens and dozens of essays his entire life about this precise chasm internal to the left and the kind of psychoanalytic, because you sort of need psychoanalysis, I think, to repair this. Because I mean, I think, like, again, I think Marx's position is not to take one side, but to actually look at this as a dialectical problem, if that makes sense. Because I wouldn't want to, what I think is more interesting is to walk away from this, not as like holier than thou, but also to sort of recognize that what happens in social media when you are a victim of a pile-on, and Ben, I've witnessed you being a victim. And by the way, I love the way that you let it roll off of you and you never take it personally, at least as I can tell, as far as I can tell. I try not to take it personally myself, and I don't think that we should, in a certain sense. I see a lot of leftists that take it too personally. They become post-leftists. They abandon the idea of the left, or it makes them bitter. It makes them resentful. I know you're not like that, and that's one of the things I like about you. It's hard. It's hard to exist on the left in such a milieu, no doubt. But nonetheless, I think there's also like an ethics, perhaps, of humility. There's the question of joy, but I feel like our problems are so immense. Like, we can talk about how to cultivate joy on another occasion. But perhaps one of the things we need to talk about now is how to, like, mitigate this often totally unnecessary conflicts and pile-ons and things like that. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're unavoidable. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that to a certain extent they might be. I think that there's, you know, like, because I think that a lot of what we're seeing when we think about this as it manifests on the left, right? I mean, the stuff that Fisher is, you know, talking about at the beginning of this essay, right? You know, that, like, second paragraph, left-wing Twitter can often be a miserable dispiriting zone. Earlier this year, there were some high-profile Twitter storms in which particularly left-identifying figures were called out and condemned. What these figures had said was sometimes objectionable. Important, he's not denying that. But nevertheless, the way in which they were personally vilified and hounded left a horrible residue, the stench of bad conscience and witch-hunting moralism. And so I think what he's describing so well there, and, you know, at some point we really are going to have to get to my partial defense of the vulgar class reductionism, but what he's describing so well there, I think, is really a confluence of two things. So one of them is the one that he has his finger on in this essay, which is the sort of pathologies that are, like, internal to the left, and I think to a great extent are downstream of this sort of deep sense of powerlessness we're getting at earlier when we're talking about capitalist realism. And I think that's absolutely a thing. And I think that this is why, you know, you see stuff like this playing out in offline leftist spaces too, right? Like, different ways, right? But it's not just an online phenomenon, sadly. But then I think the other one is just about, like, look, I mean, he's talking about Twitter. I mean, some of that is just,
right.
innate to the platform. That, I mean, this is actually on the long list of reasons I think it's really bad to have major communications platforms in the hands of for-profit companies, because you know, they have all the same incentive. You know, they have the bad incentives, you know, to you know, they have the same bad incentives that tobacco companies have, right? You know, to make their product more addictive. And I think that if you look at the way that it plays out, you know, in terms of, so like, you know, the sort of non-left text that I you know, find really useful here is the John Ronson's "So You've Been Publicly Shamed," which is like around
you
the
wrote
same
about that
time.
in your book. Yeah,
a few years earlier, and and in the, you know, and I think that like a lot of what he's getting at there about feedback loops that are, you know, that are built into you know, social media is really perceptive, right? That you know, that if you've got you know, like he has that great analogy about about like the speeds, you know, speed signs that'll automatically show you how fast you're driving as you go past, which don't look like, on the surface, it seems crazy to think that that would actually get anybody to slow down, because it's not giving anybody any information they don't already have.
Right.
You know, what the speed limit is, any traditional low-tech speed sign will tell you, and how fast you're going. Every car tells you that right inside the car, but seeing the two numbers put together gives you this like immediate validation loop for slowing down a little bit, and it actually does work. And I think that that same kind of immediate validation, I think, is built into the structure of social media platforms with, you know, likes and retweets and, you know, all of that stuff. And, you know, I think that's very much on purpose. And I think algorithms, you know, algorithms reinforce things that are, you know, going to get people to click and engage, which oftentimes, you know, include, include sort of this kind of, like, I think that lends itself to this kind of hair trigger mass denunciation that we're really talking about when we sort of use phrases like canceling the pylons or something, which is why I think you see it a lot outside the left. But then, yeah, the other thing is also the left is not in a good place and hasn't been for a long time. And I think that's reflected here too. And, you know, I think the joylessness is not unrelated to this, because
very true.
Like, it's because look, I mean, this is the you know, if all you're doing, if all you see, and I don't want to, you know, I don't want to repeat too much of the book here, but if all you think you're doing at some basic level is you're just engaged in you know, you're just sort of doing a symbolic moral protest against like the many iniquities of the world, which, if deep down you don't really believe that you can win, like that is what you're doing, then you know, that's not very fun. There's nothing to make you optimistic about that. I mean, you know, you're just kind of, you know, you're just sort of doing the accounting for your own soul, that, you know, that like see, I'm a good person. I spoke out against it. And I think that lends itself to spending a lot of time questioning the commitment of other people. And, you know, and I think that again, I think that's the sort of in-house thing that's producing a lot of the vampire, you know, the vampire castle effect. But I mean, I guess this does get us back in a way to the, you know, vulgar class reductionism, because it seems to me that, like, well, here's the connection I make, right? Like, it's just that, like, it seems to me that if you have, you know, if you want people to feel good about what they're doing, I think that you, like, you know, because why are you doing this? I mean, like, you were talking about why, you know, I mean, I've, you know, certainly seen you be the subject of a couple of these in the recent past, but but like, you know, to whatever extent I'm able to, and at this point I really kind of am. I certainly took it much more personally a few years ago than I do now. I mean, at this point, it just sort of feels like, it's like rainstorms in early spring. It's just a thing that's going to happen. Like
the New Left review one was pretty funny, where you retweeted me like, okay, this is pretty good, guys. This is the vapes for G.A. Cohen. You were like, you got me. You got me.
Exactly. Yeah. No, yeah, can't argue with that. But yeah,
that's the thing. It's like, I think at this day and age, if you see, part of what is so interesting about this essay is that in a capitalist realist milieu, we have a new perception on the left that has emerged that is against leadership, right? That is against creating a program that Fisher says would be willing to convert people to its agenda. I don't know if "convert's" the right word,
sure,
but but part of that is also dealing with the fact that the left needs to be able to speak to people that are not college educated professionals. And one of the effects of the privatization and the individualization of leftist public sphere is the sense in which there's no room for forgiveness for a breach in a moral norm that the left holds dear. There's no room for tolerating any deviation from, and then who defines the terms of that deviation? It's not clear. But what is clear is that it's an intolerant left, right? It's intolerant to unformed or vulgar opinions about things, right? And I think that often we witness a lot of cases, as Fisher even says, that are kind of borderline. It's not the right way to say that. Maybe that's definitely not, it's certainly not racist, but it's unrefined, it's unsophisticated for sure. But the response of so many on the left is total shame. And I think most people now probably enter the left having dealt with some of that shame themselves. And it is interesting because I had Larry Rickles, who was my dissertation advisor. He's a great Freudian kind of Frankfurt School guy. And I asked him, what's your theory about incels? And then he went and he studied the incels for a few weeks, and he came back and he said it's a community formed around a bond of self-pity, right? And I find that this subculturalization and privatization of the left is we're risking a situation in which these subculture communities form around negative affects, around their own sadness, around their own melancholia, around their own self-pity. And the effects of that can be super pernicious, right? It's just super sensorial, you know? You lose all rationality, you lose all grounding in joy. I mean, that's one aspect, but I would even say in principles. So the idea of resurrecting a left that could stand on its own 2 feet with principles becomes very difficult. How do you pierce through these kind of subcultures? That becomes, I think, the question that the essay is sort of, leaving to us, bequeathing to us, right? Again, Fisher's claim is not to alienate them. And I don't think we should either.
Sure.
That's only playing their same game in a certain way. There needs to be a different engagement, like throwing a life preserver to them in some way might be one way to get at it. Finding common ground is another way. Forging solidarity. These are the things that I think are absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
But anyways, I'm going on a thread, but
no, but I mean,
please.
I think that so you're talking about how to get out of it, and it is very. I think it's maybe important to think about the actual metaphor in the title, which we haven't talked about at all, right? But it's like that you're sort of thinking about that when it's the vampire castle, right? So you're like Jonathan Harker, in Castle Dracula, that the whole thing about that is, you know, I mean, there's a sort of, you know, maybe psychological metaphor there, but I mean also that it's like a thing that's very, very hard to escape, right? Like that's
Right.
you know, that's kind of.
But that's actually part of the problem, I think, because I think Fisher would revise the title.
Okay.
Because again, Fisher's trajectory, because what does it mean to exit it? This is a question I want to ask you. Could we not say that there's a kind of correlation between the left's defeats and the left's failures in big projects, from Corbyn to Sanders to other, you know, when we have a possibility? Is there not a correlation between that and the proliferation of this precise phenomenon?
Oh, no question.
Right, no question. No. With that fact known, what does it mean to advocate depoliticization, to advocate exit, to sort of, you know, do the grill pill thing, as the Chapo guys say? I'm not sure that that's what's called for here. I think the question would be to remain. I don't know. I just don't know if I believe in political exit. I'd rather engage. I'd rather actually engage it myself.
You know, we want to, you know, exit the vampire castle. We don't want to exit, you know, politics. This is, you know, presumably, you know, you go outside and that's where the, you know, that's where all the action is. But yeah, look, I mean, I think, you know, I don't know, maybe come back with all of the, you know, with God, the Van Helsing and everybody, and you know, you know, and take them on in the castle. But you know, but I think that there. So I think there are a couple of points here. One is because you're right that of course that this stuff has a lot to do with those defeats. I mean, you know, I think that it has. Of course, the essay was written. You know, I mean, Fisher commits suicide in 2017. The essay, you know, I think you said 2013.
2013, November. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, yeah, I think I saw 2014. It doesn't matter, but they have a, that's, you know, that's all before, you know, those most recent defeats. In fact, before the things that that were being defeated had even come up, really, right? Like in those examples. But it's certainly downstream of some much bigger defeats in the past, right? I mean, this is the you know, I always, you know, I remember a couple of years ago, David Griscom and I did a stream with the What's Left of Philosophy people, and somebody asked about why like the kind of right-wing intellectuals we get now are so much worse and less interesting than the ones we used to. And I said, you know, part of the answer might just be that they were like battling a better, more confident, more interesting version of the left at that time, right?
Yeah.
You know, so like, you know, somebody like Hayek and von Mises are reacting to people who are so, you know, are so confident and you know, and are so on the upswing that they're like spending all this time thinking about exactly how economic planning is going to work after the revolution. Whereas, you know, Jordan Peterson is, you know, reacting to somebody, you know, whoever at the University of Toronto is like yelling at him about, you know, non-standard pronouns, you know, so I think that there's, you know, so I think that like, I think in fact, there's a point in like, you know, over the course of the 20th century, like in stages, right, where the left was defeated so profoundly that like it's almost hard to even remember that like that was a defeat. There was a time when, you know, we had the possibilities were much more open. So I think it's downstream of that. And then I think when you did get these sort of moderate, you know, modest resurgences, right? I mean that like Sanders and Corbyn, that, you know, and I will actually say, I mean, when I was writing Canceling Comedians, you know, as crazy as this seems now, right? I remember having the thought at the time, right? You know, maybe Bernie Sanders, by the time this book comes out, you know, will have won, and we'll be in a totally different political landscape. and a lot of this stuff will seem irrelevant. And then, you know, of course, I didn't have that problem, but like I think a lot of that, you know, became much worse afterwards. You know, I think because of that defeat. So given that, then, you know, I think that the sort of like the pessimistic conclusion is that you actually maybe need to get some points on the board in the real world to change the conditions that give rise to some of this stuff, which would be bad because then like there's nothing we can do right now. But I also think there maybe are a few things that we can do right now. I think that you know, I think that one of them is, I mean, I actually think like one of the reasons, you know, that I think this stuff is worth critiquing, because, you know, I have for a long time when I first started doing this stuff, I didn't, right? Because my thought process was always like, look, I don't, sure, a lot of leftists do silly and annoying things, but like this is so far down my list of priorities that like I'm just, you know, it's just not even worth spending time criticizing. But I think that I think the problem then is that everybody else can see them, and it makes the left a much less attractive place. And so,
Yeah.
And also a lot of people, even who are already, you know, socialists, leftists involved in this stuff, you know, you said that earlier, right? They, you know, I mean, in some cases, people might become post-left, whatever that means, or they might just sort of drop out of politics entirely, right? Like, I'm sure everybody who's listening to this can think of people that, like, probably by name, that these things have happened to, right? So
that's what I mean, because people in the chat are asking, how is this related to politics? Because I mean, I think this VC, the VC problem, the vampire castle problem, is about the public sphere. It's about, as I understand it, right? It's not about the left sort of materially on the ground doing political organizing. It's a tendency that emerges within what in queer theory they call counterpublics. It's a very great concept that came out in the early 80s out of queer theory, which is that basically like the dominant public sphere is sort of not available to truly subversive leftist activities. So, you know, the left has constructed what they call counterpublics. I perceive the vampire castle phenomenon as a kind of hegemonic force that defines the meaning of the left within various counterpublics. The problem with that is that has spillover effects to the wider meaning of the left itself. So if you abandon that fight, what the problem is that you will have retreated into some cave of, you know, whatever, not engaging on social media, not writing yourself. Because I mean, one of the takeaways here is actually to be for leadership, to be for podcasting, to be for writing, to be for engagement, etc. To not be apathetic to those things, even in a moment which is relatively depoliticized in actuality, right? Because otherwise, the meaning of the left is at stake, and I think that's what that's what this is about.
So that's the point, though, right? Because the meaning of the left is at stake. This is why I think that it is actually, you know, worth sort of publicly criticizing VC, because I think that is, you know, because I think that there are people who, like, if that's what they think, you know, if that's what they think the left is, they're going to have no interest in it. And there are a lot of people who are already even deep into the left who, because they think that's what the left is, they become depoliticized, or they go on some strange, you know, political journey to, you know, some sort of, you know, whatever that post-left thing is. And I think that, you know, so I think that like one reason to criticize this stuff, even if you go with the relatively pessimistic assumption that most of the people who you're describing are not going to be persuaded to, you know, mend their ways, is that, you know, it like sort of raising a flag and being like, hey, I'm a leftist, I'm a socialist, and I have no truck with any of this stuff. I think helps people, you know, helps people see like, oh, wait a second, this isn't a package deal. Like I don't have to, I don't have to buy into this sort of culture of constant moralistic denunciation to be part of this thing. And I think that has value in itself, even if nobody's convinced to mend their ways. And then also, I think that some people might actually be convinced to mend their ways. Although I think a lot of it, relies on modeling something that's better, and again, this is related to the point that you actually do ultimately need to get some points on the board in terms of like real world victories to change the conditions that give rise to the VC. But like the point I wanted to make earlier, and then I'll throw back to you, is just this, which is that I think that where the joy and the sort of class and identity stuff all come together with this for me is that if you're going to be excited about being part of this political project, and it's going to be, a source of joy in your life and not the opposite of that, right? Like, I think that there has to be some kind of, you can have countercultures for a while that are like, actual like 60s style countercultures, although, even those tend to be pretty transient. But like, I think that if you want this to be something that people are going to be excited about, it should actually be delivering something for them in real life, right? Or at least or at the very least, you've got to have a sense that it's something that might deliver for you in your real life.
Yeah.
And so
yeah.
I think that's where that sort of like, strategic, focus on, universal material concerns and all of that stuff, comes in, because so often, I mean, my problem with a lot of, left coded identity stuff is that it's so hard to see what the takeaway is supposed to be. It's like, what do you actually want to happen in the real world
Right.
that would solve this problem?
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's often ambiguous. It feels as if you are being inducted into a kind of patrolman for policing or censoring others. And that's the kind of basis of your membership into the subcommunity. And I think that part of the problem here, Ben, is also that the sort of political ether is still very much a liberalism. And I think that the liberalism that is sort of in the air, especially in American politics, is a very morally righteous liberalism, right? It has the idea that at any given time in American society, we're on the cusp of a fascist takeover. And so if you have that view, you're going to think that somebody who's uneducated, who doesn't hold the right exact opinions, will, most likely be associated with this possible specter of fascism. And I think that a lot of people unconsciously internalize a sense of political rivalry in that way. And that creates a certain failure of solidarity. I mean, the other thing is that, a lot of this stuff, even though it's based on this sort of sensorial or kind of acerbic attacking others, I'd like to envision a left that maybe is not naively joyful, but that would allow people to come in and create a space for complaint about like real exploitation, right? About like shit that actually happens day to day that bothers them about capitalist day-to-day life. You know what I mean? Like that would be a left that could channel, because a part of what the left is supposed to do is channel antagonism. And part of that also is to give people a chance to vent and to, I mean, with all of these liberals writing books about how the so-called white working class is a resentful, deeply problematic, deeply reactionary, whatever that means. It's not even a class. It's this sort of weird amalgamation of a kind of ethnic category, I guess. Too often people on the left internalize that as if it's a valid way of thinking about what constitutes reactionary. So part of the problem is that on the left, the meaning of reactionary is so ever present that anyone could fall into it, seemingly just by making one wrong opinion, one wrong slip. And that seems to me as very impatient. I think what Mark was interested in his acid communism work, which I very much appreciated, was the virtue of patience. To be patient with people, to be patient with people is one way to repair this issue, because part of Mark's mental health, right, literally came from the effect of the VC coming at him. Okay. And so I think what he was trying to do is sort of face the reality of the VC. It is a real thing. I mean, these are real people that we know, and that in many cases are on the left, and also in many cases themselves. I know countless examples of people who used to be very much affiliated, because I mean, I went to grad school, I certainly swam in those waters. I'm sure you have too. Things are fluid. People are not always stuck there.
Sure.
It's very much a youthful phenomenon as well. I don't think we pointed that out. It has an ideology of paternalism. It does, in the sense that it comes from a misplaced frustration about their own labor situation, their own future, etc. But as people have families and they age, a lot of that hyper liberal stuff will change. They may become apolitical. They may become more socialistic. So I don't know. I guess my message would be, how do we cultivate the kind of patience on both sides of this chasm? On both sides of this chasm. And the thing on the working class that I want to say, and kick it back to you, is I'm obviously huge on working class. But I think where Fisher makes an error is in the following way.
Okay.
Which is, he wants to sort of suggest, and it's a very British thing, because in the British class system, it's older than ours, it's more rigid than ours, and it has a different cultural appearance than the American system does. And the exclusions of working class people in Britain are very pronounced. They're very obvious. Like, they recently did a study, and I think it's only 6% of people in the media, okay, writ large, producers, you name it, across the board, come from working class backgrounds in the UK. Okay. The same dynamic occurs in the US, of course, but because we don't have a history of socialism, okay, like Europe does, we can't see class the same way. That's why I'm big on class literacy and being careful at the same time of not being class reductionist. And I only say I'm careful there is because I'm kind of sort of a student of history. I mean, I've seen how socialist movements can err when they become ultra class reductionist. What's an example of that? An example of that, just one quick example. I think the way that Mark talks about Russell Brand in the article is class reductionist, in the sense that he imputes some moral effect about Brand's class origins. Okay. Now, I have working class origins, but I'm not going to sign up for a view, and I don't think you would either, although maybe you would, that we should privilege some moral quotient to somebody by virtue of their class origins. I don't think that's a Marxist vision of class, but I think that Fisher flirts with that to his own detriment.
Yeah, I actually agree with that last part. I think that there's like class as an identity where you're really talking about class background, and oftentimes there's some blurring of the lines between what Marxists mean by class, which is about economic structures. What are your relations? What's your relationship to the means of production, and class in a sort of cultural sense, which comes up both in what you were talking about the rigidity of the British class system, and also the example about like the white working class, right? That like after like Trump won the first time, there were all these like New York Times articles that were like these like weird anthropological expeditions into the American heartland to go find the white working class. And then like half the time the people they were talking to were like literally members of the petty bourgeoisie. They were like, like some guy who owns a boat store or something. And so yeah, I mean, which I think you get a lot when you sort of start using. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that like class-based identity politics is sort of no better than any other identity politics, but I think that you've used this phrase a bunch of times, class, reductionism, and oftentimes I feel like what people mean by that, it's sort of notoriously not a very well-defined term, but like what people often seem to mean by that is like is like sort of a moral critique of people being like indifferent to like non-economic forms of oppression or something like that, right? That's often what people are really getting at when they say class reductionism. Or for the wine track of this, there are people like McCarthy and Desan or William Clare Roberts who talk about what they call class abstractionism, which is the alleged sin of abstracting from the fact that like class has a sort of class structure has a kind of explanatory primacy in explaining a bunch of things about capitalist society, to the unwarranted conclusion that class has a political primacy in thinking about how the left can move forward. And I have to say, in both cases, maybe especially the second one, I don't really see it in the views of the people these labels are usually attached to, right? Like sort of, I mean, I know you're a fan, as I am, of like Adolf Reed, who's probably accused of this more than anybody is. Or like, your Vivek Chibbers, or frankly me, I'm mentioned in that William Clare Roberts article. But like that, I don't see a lot of evidence of that, right? Like it seems to me that the reason that most socialists in this vein sort of think that class has a certain kind of political primacy is like a pretty straightforward strategic reason.
It does,
right?
No, and it is, and it is, and it is, and it's strategic. I think where the problem comes in for me is when we, unbeknownst to ourselves, engage in a polemical dance with liberals, and we end up moralizing categories in the same way that they moralize the various identity or subaltern groups that they try to protect. And in fact, their position in response to us would be a class-first politics would risk a couple things. One, how their question would be, like you see this in William Clare Roberts, I think, and others, how are you going to ensure that categories that exceed class experience, vulnerable categories and so on, are protected in your politics, right? Your politics, therefore, is not wide enough, not a wide enough camp. I think that in a certain way, labels are labels. I have a problem with class reductionism as a label precisely because it sparks this debate that creates misunderstanding on the one hand. On the other hand, I think that as a Marxist orientation to class, I would agree, Ben, that the best way to think about the primacy of class in politics is the strategic question, which is that if you truly want to revolutionize capitalism, you have to rely upon organizing the broad masses of the working class. Now, here's a caveat that a lot of contemporary Marxists are debating at the current moment, which is what elements of the working class are we to prioritize? So we see a lot of folks from like Midwestern Marx to Damage Magazine and others say, well, it must be productive labor. labor that is directly productive, even not necessarily service-based labor, right? And then you see people like Gabriel Winant saying, no, 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 well, the vast majority of the working class is service-based. So what does this even mean? You're being falsely nostalgic, right? So that's an interesting sub-debate that I find compelling. But in both instances, we're still talking about organizing the working class. I think the VC, the Vampire Castle, is off on something completely different. They're
I mean, look,
you know what I mean?
I mean, I think that don't get me wrong, I'm very enthusiastically in favor of organizing, service workers. And, I had, if you look at my, Twitter from like, 2 years ago, it was like nothing but me, but constant celebrations of organizing wins at Starbucks, and I think that's good, but I think that I'm not as familiar with the Midwestern Marx version of this, right? But I think like certainly in terms of the Damage Magazine version, which I'm more familiar with and sympathetic to, it's not like the sort of like infra-Haas thing about service workers where it's like you're where
right.
I think he sort of mixed up the thing that Marx says about productive and unproductive labor in Capital Volume 2 with like with something that's like almost metaphysical about the kind of labor that you're doing, when Marx's actual point is just that some of his analysis of class structure only applies to workers who are doing things that replenish the what he calls the variable capital fund, the part of revenues that are used to pay your wages, right? So it's has absolutely nothing to do with service versus manufacturing or anything like that, but I don't think they're doing that. I think they're making a sort of reasonable strategic point, which is like, look, it's good for the people that like Winnet is writing about, right? It's obviously good for like nurses to have unions, and it's good for those unions to be as militant as possible and all of that stuff. But the sort of point that I think goes beyond nostalgia about manufacturing is just that you have a kind of power to like there's a sort of social power to grind things to a standstill, to sort of inflict real pain on the capitalist class that you have from manufacturing organizing that you just don't, right? From like again, it's not no shade on nurses and baristas, which are both good things to be, right? And very important for I mean, look, I think that nurses especially, you obviously need those very badly to, for to have society. And, I think coffee shops are a good thing to have. And I hope we'll continue to have them under socialism because it's good for people to go out and socialize in that way. But like but I think that, but it's just not the case that it gives you the kind of strategic leverage that you
That's
get.
true. But at the same time, that's totally true. But at the same time, tailing the Democratic Party and the current configuration of organized labor, which has zero class struggle orientation involved with it, if you know what I mean by the notion of class struggle unionism, right? That would be the precondition for the politicization of that sector of the working class, right? So I think what we're talking about, though, is slightly upstream from that in the VC debate, because the VC debate is a kind of meta class, if that's the right phrase, conversation about the role of class within the left leadership, right? Because Fisher's point is that class origins are disavowed by the petty bourgeois left, and they prefer to completely remove any concern at that level. And then therefore they create institutions that don't speak to the working class because they're not led by the working class. That's a valid point. That's a valid point. Like, for example, Bashkar and several Jacobin folks have that think tank that produced a report that showed that majority of Americans feel that they would be most willing to vote for political candidates at a local level and national level that have working class backgrounds. But the fact that we're dominated by liberal institutions that say nothing about that's not even like a relevant category, that then means that it's not talked about. So I think Fisher's right to bring that onto the agenda. I just think that he's wrong to play the liberal game and risk making it into a moral thing. No. I think from a strategic point of view, we will find more converts in the working class when our institutions and our intellectuals represent the working class. That's valid. I think that this post-structuralist idea against representation, that we should be against leadership, that we should see all aspirations or ambitions to leadership as a grift. I'm totally opposed to that idea. It's so cynical. It's so insincere. It's so cynical, you know?
And all movements have leaders. The only question is whether they're sort of openly acknowledged and, you know, you can have democratic accountability or whether they're like de facto. And, you know, this is also, I mean, look, this is not unrelated to why, you know, like I think, you know, like consensus forms of decision making are really bad, and organizations that practice them sort of constantly end up having to purge dissidents because otherwise you're not going to reach consensus. I think like voting is actually good, and having and having sort of openly acknowledged, you know, leadership through elections and all that stuff is good. And, you know, and there's I mean, I'm trying to think what I could add to this, except maybe just to go back to what you said earlier in the conversation, because I think you said something that was important and clarifying for me when you were linking this essentially to what we were talking about in the show a couple of weeks ago, which is the fascism debate. That, you know, there is this kind of like this kind of liberal and left like apocalypticism that's, you know, that like you're it's always, you know, it's always like winter 1932. And
well, I think the part of that, Ben, is that a lot of leftists don't have family members, if they are of middle class or upper middle class, that are from the MAGA constituency. And so one of the things that leads to, I think, is a sense in which there's a profound otherization. I mean, like myself, I can speak briefly. My whole, you know, pretty much my whole family is pro-Trump, you know, and so, you know, I've had to adapt to being a person on the left, being a Marxist. You know, I'm over 40 now, so all of those fights have happened. But, you know, it gives one a different antenna to the meaning of reactionary. In a sense, you see reactionaries a little bit more malleably in a certain way when you literally are from you know, families that hold these far right views. And I feel like that's an important thing that a lot of folks on the left should, you know, why we need to get beyond some of this, why we need to promote a solidarity culture, I think, because these experiences teach us a hell of a lot, I think, about the true like basis of political ideologies in America, and how, frankly, so much of the Trumpist base is itself dealing with depoliticization, just as the left is, in a certain weird way. So there's this kind of exaggerated paranoia about the meaning of conservatism and the right in America, that the left isn't doing itself any favors by not being more inclusive to people. Even though I am meeting a lot of young people that are very like wayward, ideologically wayward these days, you know, just in like political events that I do in DC, was recently at a big
Yeah.
DSA event, and I met a lot of kids that are like literally saying to me like, I voted for Trump in 2020 and now I'm like totally lost. I don't know what to do, what to think. So there's a lot of that's the other thing. It's like, if you're on the left, I feel like it should be your duty to want to convert people. I mean, my great teacher, Lukács, one of my favorite Marxists, says that after 1917 happened, he converted to Marxism.
Yeah.
And he's saying that in a secular way, of course.
Sure.
But there's something right about that. There's something true about that. You know, that when you adopt a political ideology, it should be because it is true and just, that it is a sound thing that you feel in your heart and soul. And it is just so hard to imagine how people could enter into a space where they feel judged and persecuted in advance and shamed and this and that and this and that. It's hard. I mean, maybe it toughens us up in some ways, and that can be seen as a good thing down the line. But I certainly want to see it change.
Yeah,
I mean, maybe like
absolutely.
I'm being overly optimistic, but
no, I mean, I think it can. But yeah, I think that like, but that made a lot of, and yes, I mean, I have, yeah, I mean, not my parents or my siblings or anybody, but I have had, let's put it this way: people that you might see at Thanksgiving, who have those views for sure. But yeah, I mean, I have, and it's like, obviously, I mean, this is part of what I was talking about with Bessner and Daniel Steinmetz-Jenkins, that like, if you, I mean, it's such a crazy thing, because if you have like a fundamental critique of American society, even achieving the sort of most minimal milquetoast social democracy, never mind any of those bigger ambitions, would be completely impossible without winning over, like, a lot of people who, voted for Trump at least once, for example, because just mathematically that doesn't work, right? I mean, if all you're trying to do is like centrist liberalism, and so your only question is how do you get to 270 electoral votes, there are other ways of doing that. But if you want to like fundamentally change American society, you need a much bigger majority than that, and that's going to include a lot of those people. And if you've ridden them off in your head as a horde of Nazis, then you're going to have a problem. And I think that, like, what you said earlier made a lot of sense to me, because if you sort of if you have this extreme pessimism, then it makes a certain amount of sense. It's like, look, if we're about to have to go underground, then like, maybe my top priority is kind of getting rid of the people who aren't entirely reliable, because that's what's going to really matter. Whereas if you think that there are actually vistas of positive change that are possible, then like the calculus is completely different. Like, I mean, this is like that old cliche about how the right is constantly looking for converts and the left is constantly hunting for heretics is really right. I mean, this is right. I see this all the time, that if people that like, if you're like a left kind of media figure and you say 1.5 things that that the right is simpatico to, there are all these like right-wing media people who'd be like, oh brother, welcome aboard, right? And the vice versa is very much not true, right? Like, let's put it that way, right? Like, if you say 1.5 things that people disagree with, then then you're an enemy, which sort of makes sense in light of that mentality you talked about earlier, where like having a kind of leftist commitment is this extremely fragile thing that it's going to like slip away at any time. Like, and I can't tell you how many times I've seen people say about me in some of those instances you were referencing earlier, or I've seen people say about other people. It's like, oh, give it 6 more months and Ben will have released his, Dave Rubin, Why I Left the Left video, right? That this is like, it's always N+6 months, is when that's going to happen. But because that's what I think there's also an allergy to nuance there, that that like the sort of like that if you see every political issue as a sort of matter of basic moral commitment. So the only reason somebody would come on the wrong side of it is that they don't have the right moral commitments. There's something's wrong with their soul, rather than just that like shit's complicated and sometimes people get things wrong. I think that's a big that's a big part of it. But but I also do think, and actually maybe want to wrap up on this and get your thoughts on it. Like, I don't know, something I keep thinking about is that we have a so there's this phrase from, Karl Kautsky, I think originally, and then Rosa Luxemburg and a bunch of other people said it. They were faced with a choice between socialism and barbarism. And I think that as rhetorically powerful as that can be, right, sometimes I think we really need to wean ourselves off of that, because this kind of belief that like something apocalyptically horrible is always just about to happen, I think leads to or can lead to certainly a lot of very bad politics, and I think it's not good for patience, that you were talking about earlier, right? With late Fisher, the value of patience, that like because if you think, look, in the sense that it's true that we're faced with the choice between socialism or barbarism, I mean, since I don't actually think that the Reichstag's going to burn down next month, right? Like I think that most likely the kind of barbarism that we're facing is just the ordinary, mundane, day-to-day barbarism of diabetics dying because they can't afford their insulin, and people in foreign countries being killed with drones and all that stuff. And I think I think that should be enough. I think people should be able to get excited about opposing those things. And, especially because, like the whole conversation has been about the dismal state of the left. And I think we agree that that's not something we should just sort of like accept as permanent, right? That you think you can turn it around. But if you're starting from this dismal place and you're going to turn it around, and like eventually you want to achieve socialism, that's all a really long-term project. I mean, you have to be willing to think in terms of decades, right, to make any sense of that at all.
No, I mean, I think that many things come from what you say. Let's connect it first to Fisher. So one of the things that Fisher did in his later work was he introduced a category that others had developed, like Paul Mason and others, called post-capitalism. I'm not in love with this idea, but it's basically it's the notion that kind of capitalism cannot survive based on the weight of its current contradictions. So something on the horizon is mutating into something worse. Like McKinsey Wark has this idea in what they call the neo-feudal thesis. The neo-feudal thesis is basically that we're already in a post-capitalist horizon, and then that sanctions them to sort of develop a whole new set of demands. For Jodi Dean, for example, she thinks that neo-feudal post-capitalist idea is valuable because you can be radicalizing to people. Because if all of the promises embedded in capitalism, like meritocracy and the middle class ideal, etc., are no longer available, well, that's going to be galvanizing to people to want to revolutionize. So another question that we haven't talked about is sort of the desire of revolution. Now, one of the interesting things about that, if you read this new book called If We Burn, the author's name escapes me, but it's a very widely read
Evans,
book.
right? That's the
Yes, exactly. Rodrigo Nunes, a Brazilian philosopher, is at the backbone of this work, and he has a theory very close to Mark Fisher about melancholia on the left, because he thinks that he wrote a book called Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, and he argues that all of the agitation, let's call it, or uprisings or insurrectionary protest activity from like alter globalization up to the Floyd uprising, okay, failed precisely because the left was unable to get its act together in deciding on whether it should be vertical or horizontal. And one of his prescriptions, by the way, is very interesting. This is Nunez, which is that we should abandon the concept of revolution. Kind of goes to what you're saying, Ben. And one of the things that I hate about this claim, I'm going to write a review of this book, actually. I gave a presentation about it in Beirut recently. Is basically he thinks we should abandon revolution because the working class has no longer possesses what he calls a transitive relationship to the social structure. In other words, he doesn't think that we can organize the working class in a revolutionary mode any longer. He thinks that's kind of like a 20th century thing, that it's now gone. So for me, since I would want to push back against that, I am willing to postpone a hyper commitment to some naive idea that some spontaneous insurrection will somehow magically bring us to a revolutionary place. If that were true, I think the sequences that Bevins talks about in his book would bring us there, but they haven't brought us there. So I do want to exert some caution in that regard. I agree with you in there. And I also think that a left that naively puts all of its cards in, it gambles everything on a grandiose notion of revolution without the material organizational structure to make that realizable, is going to eat its own tail, right? It's going to have the VC dynamic emerge again and again. So it's all about political organization and creating the wherewithal of the working class to get into a position where we could, because you see, the dignity of a revolutionary left will only come like we can only say that word, right, with confidence, without like sounding like without sounding like we're faking it, when we have a serious set of organizational parties, I would even say in a Gramscian sense, cultural institutions in place that would be able to truly express that view, right? Because right now that view is too diffused. It's too diffused and it's too privatized. Again, I think that's one of the main themes of this conversation, is that the VC phenomenon is synonymous with the privatization of the public sphere of the left. And what happens when the public sphere is privatized is this pernicious, backbiting, sensorial, kind of punishing, moralistic, individualized problems, right? So I think we're far off from it, and that's a long answer, but
no, that's fair. I want to, I mean, I think at a future conversation, I want to untangle what you mean by revolution, right? Because I think that there's like a because I think that is, I think that's like a deceptively simple word that means like a few different things, and I think depending on which one we have in mind, right? I think that I think the answer is going to matter. I think that's going to matter a lot for the answer. But because I think a lot of people, sort of hear revolution and they think about like the French or Russian revolutions, oftentimes in a way that's like a sort of, it's like a, montage of people building barricades and stuff like that. And I think that I think a transition to a different, mode of production that happened in advanced democracy and, in the, 21st century, I think it would probably look different from that in a lot of ways. What it would look like is a really interesting question and is worth exploring. And I think the fact that so many people are so fuzzy about that is not unrelated to what we've been talking about this whole time. But
no, we need a new imaginary of the meaning of revolution that would be delinked from the apocalyptic catastrophism of how it currently is conceived of, right? Because it's currently conceived as fire and great chaos, right? out of which, right? And this I think is a very unpatient and very unrefined theory. Because in the Second International period, like during the time of Kautsky, one of the definitions of revolution was working class majority in parliamentary system.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, so there are like layers that we should break down in a future convo, because I think that's huge. About humbling ourselves a bit, about where we're at, realistically. So that would be cool to go through that.
No, we absolutely should do that. Figure out something to read to ground that, and then do that. Let's put that in the books. But meanwhile, because I was so excited to talk about Mark Fisher when you first came on, I didn't really tell people who you were, any of that stuff. Let's and while
somebody was asking if that's W.B. Yeats, the poet that above me, that is correct.
Oh,
and that
nice.
is Whitman. So yeah,
nice. So let's do that. And also, I mean, people may not have seen the previous episode that you were on, where we were talking about your book about Nietzsche.
Yes.
And we will definitely have a link for where, I think we do have a link in the episode description for where people can get a hold of that book, I think like a Parasite. But also, I know that we should promote it while I've got you, because I know that you've got an event that's coming right up.
Oh yeah, please.
So tell us about it.
Okay, so yes, so for folks in the Washington D.C. area, we have a few tickets left for Adolph Reed, the great socialist historian. We're coming to give a keynote at Busboys and Poets on U Street, down in the historic U Street area, on the legacy of C.L.R. James, who was actually a philosopher that I think Michael Brooks turned to and found a lot of inspiration in, by the way. I'm sure you knew that. So it's a book called Beyond the Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James and the Struggle for Socialism in America. Adolph Reed is the keynote. And then we have Pascal Robert, we have Jason Miles, we have C. Derek Varn, we have myself, we have Vanessa Wills, Billy Bunton. Very excited for, a fun with Jason. Jason is moderator. I'm sure it's going to be a quite interesting convo. Because C.L.R. James is really, he's an American socialist. We're talking about strategy of socialism. He came to America and he tried to bring socialism here for like 30, 40 years. That's really what he did. And wrote a lot of great books about it. He translated Marx's 1844 manuscripts and brought them into the Detroit Ford motor plant to do reading groups of like auto workers in the 1940s. The first translation of into English, by the way.
Oh, wow.
The manuscripts. So that's what the event's about. I think there's going to be a lot of critics of James at the event, which will be interesting. Like Adolf is not fully on board with a lot of what James has to say. So that'll be an interesting I'm very curious to see what he has to say about James, actually. So it's on June 8th, Saturday. We'll also have a live stream, and I'm happy to throw that into the,
please. Yeah.
We can link to it. People can buy tickets. People are flying out. So if you can buy the ticket to the live stream, that would help us pay for flights and things like that for poor itinerant bohemian traveling podcasters like Jason and Pascal. That's the event. Yeah.
Nice. Well, yeah, we'll definitely put a link for that in the description. Thank you so much, Daniel.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everybody. It was good. It was a good time.
All right. That was Daniel Tut. Again, we already have a link to his Nietzsche book in the description, and we will put in a link to the event that he and Jason and everybody are doing this weekend in DC. So people who wanted to get a ticket to that or to the live stream, But meanwhile, in just a few minutes, give me like 10 minutes, I think, there are sort of multiple crises going on just nothing big, just car stuff that was like combining with the internet stuff to make things chaotic when I was getting ready to come on. But give me like 10 minutes and we will start the post game for patrons. We've got Matthew Whalan. We're going to be watching that last part of the Cenk Uygur and Dave Smith versus Dennis Prager and Batya Ungar-Sargon. So we've also got some fascinating hot mic audio from the Libertarian Party convention that seemed very post-game appropriate. So I will see people there. Like I said, call it 10 minutes. Left is best.